Welcome to this special end-of-year episode of the Michael Yardney Podcast, where we take a step back to reflect on the rollercoaster that was 2027 in our housing markets and gear up for what promises to be an equally fascinating 2025. And who better to do that with than Pete Wargent, one of Australia's most respected financial and housing market analysts. Together, I want to unpack the highs, the lows and the surprises of the past year and dive into Pete's predictions for the year ahead. So let's look back and forward at the ever-evolving world of Australian property. This is one episode you won't want to miss if you're keen to know what's ahead for our housing markets.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney Podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now, here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Hi, Pete.
Hi, Michael. It's great to be on. I'm not very good at Instagram or TikTok videos, but podcasts I'm definitely good at. So looking forward to having a catch up today.
Well, looking back at the last 12 months, we've been catching up every month for our regular Big Picture podcast. And at the beginning of this year, there are a whole lot of varying forecasts. Some predicted interest rates would fall during the year. Others predicted interest rates would rise considerably. And they were saying the property market would crash. Yet others predicted we'd fall into recession. And each month, you and I conducted our Big Picture podcast and giving our listeners and our viewers clues as to how the macroeconomic factors would affect our markets. So our thoughts are on record, and clearly we actually didn't make any wild claims, and we got it right much of the time. But let's look back at the last year. I'd like to get some of your thoughts and as well as some of your views on what's ahead. So what are some of the significant trends you observed in property over 2024?
Well, I think there were maybe three main things. So in 2024, firstly, for the housing market, generally much more resilient than expected, particularly if you look at markets like Perth, where prices were up, 22% over the year. Brisbane was 12, Adelaide was 15, Sydney probably some modest growth. So I think maybe Melbourne was the one disappointing market. But overall, the housing market has held up a lot better than people might have expected maybe a year or 18 months ago. The economy has been pretty sluggish. I think you might have expected that given the trajectory of interest rates. I think at the headline level, the economy grew maybe by about 1%. But if you account for population growth of about 2.5%, well, you can do the maths on that. The economy in per capita terms is probably down about 1.5%. So pretty sluggish there. And I suppose the other main thing is inflation. We've certainly seen progress on inflation. The headline rate of inflation is down to 2.8% so far. And but yeah, we're just not quite there yet in terms of core inflation, which is about 3.5%. So lots of progress on inflation, but just not quite at the end of the tunnel just yet.
Now, just before we recorded this, I read a headline from one of the property and economic websites that said the Australian housing market's going from bad to worse. And it was sure it was a clickbait headline, but in fact, I think that the markets this year will end up around about 8% higher than they started the year, with, as you say, some markets doing particularly well, others not as well. But combined, I think they've performed better than many people expected. To me, I think one of the big surprises was the underperformance of the Melbourne property market. Neither of us expected it to go gangbusters like the Western states, but I didn't really think it would do as poorly this year. What was your big surprise for this year? What caught you off guard?
I think the thing that's taken me aback more than anything has been the sheer strength of the jobs market. I think we've just had massive employment growth over the year. We've got 14.5 million Aussies in employment, first time that's ever happened, and jobs growth of about 400,000 over the year. That's 2.7%. So even now, as we're recording this, the unemployment rate in Australia is still only 4.1%. And if you consider against some of our peers, like Canada, for example, 6.5% unemployment and related issues there. I think things are slowing quite a lot in New Zealand, for example. But Australia, well, things have just held up amazingly well. I think a lot of public sector jobs is part of the reason. and some high levels of government spending, healthcare jobs, NDIS. Yeah, I guess there's a few things, but the main thing that caught me off guard has just been the sheer strength of the labour market. I think a lot of people would have been surprised by that.
Oh, I agree entirely. We know the Reserve Bank was trying to increase unemployment to dampen wages growth and to slow the inflation rate down a bit. And as you say, it's remained at 4.1. Also, the participation rate has decreased a little bit the last figures in October, but basically it's still 67%. More Australians are working than ever before. I think some older people are staying in the market, employment market a little bit longer. That surprised me a lot. Part-time and full-time employees. We've actually never had as many people employed, have we?
No, you're right. The participation rate has been at record highs. So more females in the workforce. I think more people, as you said, probably not necessarily full-time, but more older people choosing to work for longer. And why not? There's a lot of jobs now, white collar or office-based or part-time. You don't necessarily need to be working in a labour-intensive role. So there's, the participation rate is as high as we've ever seen in Australia. So that's been a positive. And there's more dual income households around now as well.
Interestingly, we talk about unemployment. The biggest state for jobs growth annually was Brisbane. Brisbane had 6.6% job growth over the last year, and its unemployment rate is the lowest of all the big capital cities. On the other hand, Melbourne's is the highest, up 4.5%. Now, that's still not a high unemployment rate. Before COVID, we would have been thrilled if it got down to that sort of level. But I guess the jobs growth in the local economy has affected the local property markets, Pete.
I think there's a few things. Some of it is sentiment-based for Victoria. I think state debt levels have been quite high. Melbourne, lest anyone needs reminding, had some very long lockdowns, and that sort of impacted businesses and sentiment as well. So, yeah, we've had an increase in land taxes. Payroll taxes have increased as well across the state. So I guess there's more tax to pay for that debt, and that's a part of the issue. But I think a big chunk of this is just sentiment. And I'm already hearing about buyers agents and mortgage brokers starting to talk about counter-cyclical play in Victoria. So I think, some of it is a structural issue, but I think a lot of it is just sentiment-based as well.
I think one of the other big trends this year that has only got worse, disappointingly, is property investor bashing. There's a particular political party with a colour in its name that seems to be inflaming the situation, Pete.
Yes, I mean, if you look at what interest rates have done over the past year, they haven't necessarily slowed the total number of first-home buyers as much as you might have expected. I think because of the bank of mum and dad, I think parents have seen the state of the labour market or the rental market. They're trying to help their kids into the housing market. Investors have still been active, but particularly in Victoria, but actually in a lot of parts of the country, just making life less attractive for landlords. I think there's things like vacancies, taxes, and land taxes have increased, tenancy rights, and just the general tone has been sort of an anti-landlord sentiment. So, yeah, I mean, these things do go in a bit of a cycle, but at the moment, plenty of bashing of landlords, I think.
Hasn't there been? Now, interest rates, you mentioned those a moment ago. They've been on hold for a bit longer than everyone expected. Now they haven't gone up or haven't gone down. How do you think that's affected the various segments in the property market?
Well, the main thing that it has really slowed down has been construction. I think it's the construction costs have increased an awful lot since 2020. It's made it pretty difficult for a lot of developers to contemplate taking on a middle ring apartment project or a medium density project. I just don't think the returns are there, but also interest rates are a lot higher than they were. Even just for a standard residential mortgage, you might be paying 6 or 6.5% now. So I think credit has generally continued to flow to higher income households quite easily. But what it has done is shut out some lower income earners and some less wealthy borrowers. And it's also really stymied construction. So now we're facing in 2025 and probably for the next few years, a real shortage of housing. Because as you mentioned, population growth and jobs growth has been really strong, but we're just not building enough now.
Now, I think some people may not understand when they're hearing that construction costs, home building costs have slowed down. The annual rate of growth has. In fact, more recently it dropped to about 2.8%. Boy, at its peak in 2022, the annual growth rate was 23%, but that doesn't mean the cost of construction has come down. It's like inflation and everything else, isn't it, Pete? That it's now found a new level and it's not going up as much, but it's never going to get cheaper to build, is it?
It never seems to. There are some things that do get cheaper over time, things like electronics. So I think if you bought a TV maybe 40 years ago, you'd have paid quite a lot in today's dollars, I guess, for something that probably wasn't very good compared to what our kids are using today. But if you look at construction costs, I mean, we've got 50 years of figures here in front of me, and they never go down. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, one of the reasons is a big chunk of those construction costs is for labour costs, and the labour in construction is a heavily unionised sector of the workforce, so wages don't go down typically, and therefore, yes, you get periods where construction costs go up really quickly and other periods where they go up slowly, but they don't really come back down. I remember talking to Bryce, your son, only a couple of years ago about, do we think construction costs might ease or come down? And he said, well, when do they ever come down? And he was right, because they've continued to rise. So, he made a very good point there.
Now, you made a point about electronics becoming cheaper. A couple of weekends ago, I was speaking with my grandkids who are now at the age that they're getting mobile phones. Felix is 12 and he got a mobile phone. The other one's turning 11, got a mobile phone. And I said to them, how old do you think I was before I got my first mobile phone? And they said, 8 or 9. I said, no, 35. And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, first of all, there weren't mobile phones then when I was young. But the other is that I remember my first phone, which was in the car in the early 1980s, cost maybe $4,000. I don't know what that would be in today's dollar value, but probably $20,000. So yes, certain things, electronics in particular, have come down in value, but other things aren't going to change, are they?
Land prices tend to rise over time. I think particularly if you're focusing on landlocked suburbs where there's no land available for release and where population is growing, construction costs have gone up consistently over the past 50 years, I think partly because people want a different product today, bigger houses, better appliances, but also there's a lot more in terms of compliance as well, particularly for a new apartment building. If we want 5 and 6 star green energy ratings, it all comes at a cost. So yes, there are certain things that get cheaper, like televisions, but generally things like healthcare, education, land prices and construction costs, it's just one-way traffic and that's up.
Also, the expectations have changed over the years. As you said, we're expecting bigger homes. Interestingly, a couple of months ago, or actually a month ago, Pam and I were in New Zealand. I was the keynote speaker at the New Zealand Property Investor Federation conference, and in Christchurch, where they're rebuilding after the terrible earthquakes 13 years ago, they're building lots of townhouses really close to town. But the townhouses in general are 60 to 80 square meters. They're small. They're 2-story, so they don't have a front, they don't have a backyard. They're very comfortable, and often not even car spaces, so they're very comfortable living in much smaller accommodation than we're used to. That's the size of a 1-bedroom apartment in Australia.
Yeah, I've been to Christchurch. It's an interesting case study. When we stayed there, we were staying in, I think, probably the only hotel that's about 10 stories high, but all new building in Christchurch is low rise, partly because of earthquakes. So it's a different dynamic in Australia's capital cities, and that's why generally we tend to steer clear of investing in markets like Parramatta or Blacktown, where there's big tower blocks going and there's not really much in the way of constraints on supply. We tend to stick to, in say Sydney, you might look at the eastern suburbs where there's a 3-story height limit and there's more or less a continual shortage of housing. It's a slightly different dynamic in Australia depending on where you invest.
Well, that's going to change over the next couple of decades, as well as state governments are now getting more involved in encouraging high-rise or medium-density development. Now, I say encouraging because they're actually not going to build it. They've got to get people to build it and make money out of it. But we've discussed that in a regular Big Picture podcast. So just looking back at 2024, what was the biggest challenge the property market faced, in your opinion, Pete?
Well, I think there's two. The mortgage rates that we already mentioned. So a lot of people were previously on fixed mortgage rates, which is quite unusual for Australia. But
Yep.
there was a period where people were fixing at 2% or even lower in some cases. But most of those mortgages have now rolled off and they've reset to much higher mortgage rates. So that's been a big challenge. And for new borrowers, of course, they're paying those higher mortgage rates as well. The other thing was that the market regulator, APRA, has maintained a 3 percentage points lending assessment buffer. So it's pretty hard if you're a first home buyer or a lower income earner, you're being stress tested for a mortgage rate of maybe sort of 9 or 9.5%, which you're never going to pay. But that's it's a what they call a macro prudential buffer that was put in place during the pandemic and hasn't been removed. So there's not much higher risk lending around now. There's not so much in the way of interest only lending. There's very little low deposit lending, and we've got higher mortgage rates. So that's been the biggest challenge. It's just been the access to credit. And when you can access it, it's more expensive than it was.
Definitely, and that means that it's much harder to build a big portfolio. Are there any particular lessons that you think investors and others in the industry should take out of 2024?
Oh, yeah. I'm constantly reviewing from my own perspective. You do, I suppose one of the things I've learned, we were chatting even before we started recording, is that you've got different phases of your investment journey. I think, when I started out, I was all about growing the biggest business and the biggest portfolio, get the most number of properties and all this kind of thing. But then, later as you go through the journey and you've got the compounding happening, I suppose you want to make sure you're taking time to enjoy life as well, instead of trying to always chase the biggest and the best. I think probably a key lesson from 2024 is to try and think in 10-year cycles rather than looking at what's going to happen in the next 10 weeks or the next 10 months. I think the history shows that if you select good locations and focus on those for decent periods of time, you'll be handsomely rewarded. But it doesn't always follow exactly the pattern or the timing that you might expect. So also just to focus on quality over quantity, I think you'll probably find it's an easier journey if you do that.
I think they're good lessons. The trouble today with social media and the 24-hour news cycle is that it's hard not to get sidetracked with the various headlines, the clickbait headlines that they use to scare you. I think a lesson I've remembered from 2024 is there's always going to be property pessimists. You talked about the interest rates a minute ago. We didn't fall off the mortgage cliff. We didn't fall off the unemployment cliff and all those other cliffs. They were little steps. Now, I know you've been in the market a long time and you've put some of your thoughts into a couple of books. By the way, I want to speak to you about your thoughts for 2025 in just a moment. But before we do, maybe you can just tell us about the two books you brought out this year. You've been very prolific still. And so I'd like to leave in the show notes where people can get that, because it'd be some good Christmas reading. But you brought one out with Kate and then republished one of your old ones. Tell us about it, Pete.
Yeah, so the buy right approach to property investing. So that's written by Kate Bakos, and I was the co-author. So yeah, we've been talking about doing a collaboration or a project together for a number of years, and it's finally come to fruition in 2024. So that's a really good book in terms of thinking about your strategy. And Kate really brings it to life with
well, she's been around quite a few decades as well, and I'm saying that in the nicest way. So this is the perspective compared to all these young people who were flipping hamburgers last year, and this year they're now telling you how to flip properties.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it was a learning curve and exercise for me. And I think, Kate really brings the book to life with real-world case studies. And what she often has observed is that sometimes a lot of her best-performing investments and purchases have come at times when people are at their gloomiest. People are talking about interest rates going up or inflation taking off. And often those have been the performers that have been best over time. And Kate, of course, as you said, has been a buyer's agent for so long that she knows all about the locations and the property types and the tips and the traps to look out for. So, that's been a really enjoyable exercise, and the book's been selling really well in the airport stores and Dimmicks and so on. So
Yes, I'm seeing it all over social media. And what about the other one, Pete? What was that?
I actually have a book out with Michael Wilkinson called The New Wealth Way, which is unlocking the power of compounding. So that's not just a property book. That's a personal finance and investing book that just explains the power of compound interest and how you can use it to your benefit. So it does talk about property in there as well, but it's not just about real estate.
Now, interestingly, it goes to along the lines of what you mentioned a moment ago about taking a long-term view, taking a decade view on property or a couple of decade view rather than the short-term view that a lot of beginning investors have. So they get too disappointed with what's going on when the market moves up or down. But I guess that's a lesson that you and I have learned over the years, having been in the market for so long. I didn't have so much of an issue when I started, Pete, because there wasn't the blogs, there wasn't the podcast, there weren't the webinars. And so the property data you got was usually a year old. And by that time, it was out of date. So I probably didn't have those sort of issues that I know a lot of people have now. Okay.
I was just picturing you on your $20,000 mobile phone, phoning up the local real estate agent for tips. But,
yeah, and I couldn't even take it out of my car
times
in the early days. Yeah. Now, we talked a bit about 2024. What about 2025? Looking forward, have you got any particular predictions for the Australian housing markets?
Yeah, I think the big issue for next year is going to be the shortage of housing. We've still got high levels of population growth. I think construction will start to pick up because we're at a cycle nadir or market lull or low. But I think construction won't pick up so much in Sydney. There's a real problem there. Building approvals are very, very low, especially for units and apartments. And land prices are too high, construction costs are high, and a lot of developers have gone insolvent over the past year, several thousand of them now. So I think another thing to watch out for in 2025 is that the rental crisis could re-emerge as quite a pressing social or political issue. I think it's temporarily eased a little bit as people are bunched up together and people are starting to use share housing again. But yeah, I think as the economy opens up for 2025 again, I think people might find that the rental crisis hasn't been solved yet.
What about interest rates? Do you want to throw your hat in the ring to say what's going to happen?
It's hard
Knowing
to pick the
that
timing.
there are so many outside factors that the banks have got it wrong. We know the banks only recently changed their forecasts from February to two of the big banks now say May. The Reserve Bank thinks maybe we won't even get a drop in interest rates next year.
Yeah, I think if we were looking at December 2025, I'd say interest rates will be lower than they are today. I think Westpac has made the point that if the labour market starts to unravel with a high level of population growth, things could unravel pretty quickly. Look, it feels like we're in a contractionary setting at the moment. It's definitely slowing inflation. It's slowing the economy. And maybe the neutral rate is about 3.5 or something like that. So I don't know exactly on the timing, but it feels like interest rates might just ease from, say, 4.35 today to maybe mid threes. But in terms of which month and which dates and so on, well, I'll leave that to the crystal ball gazers, I think.
I think that's a good way of putting it as well, because there are so many unknowns. Okay, what about various regions or locations in Australia? There's no doubt that Perth was the standout for a couple of years now. Adelaide's done well. Brisbane has done well. Some are suggesting they're very near their peak. I mean, the Perth market's been very strong. Sure, it had a bit of a slowdown in 2022, but it's been close to 4 years now from when the COVID boom started. Booms came from a very low base. We know that, but booms don't usually last much longer than that. In fact, they don't usually last as long as the boom phase of the cycle.
I think so. So I guess look, it's an election year next year, and I think there could be. I think the coalition will propose to cut permanent migration and maybe student visas, but on the other hand, they'll propose using superannuation for housing. So look, that could net off. I think in terms of areas and locations that will do well, I think Melbourne. I'm already hearing buyers agents and mortgage brokers talking about looking at Victoria as effectively now the best value for money, capital city and state. So probably close to home for you guys would be top of the list. I think Sunshine Coast has been cooler over the past little period, but I think that could do well. And I think, maybe Newcastle and Central Coast. But I think if I was looking at the capital cities, I think a well-located townhouse or unit in Melbourne could do really well, and same for Sydney, because I just think there's just a chronic undersupply.
Oh, very much so. And really, I think Melbourne's where Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide were maybe 3 years ago. Those West Coast markets, Perth and Adelaide in particular, were driven by East Coast buyers agents buying, unfortunately, sight unseen, probably paying more than the locals would be prepared to pay in Perth and Adelaide. So that's likely if they come in bulk here to push up property values as well. But that doesn't mean every property in Melbourne's an investment grade property. But maybe that's something we can discuss when we catch up shortly on our Big Picture podcast. So looking forward to 2025, any particular risks, pitfalls, any scares you'd be suggesting people should watch out for?
Yeah, I think hopefully the South Australian listeners aren't offended by being categorised as a West Coast
No, you're
market.
right. Yes, yeah.
I guess.
What are they? Central?
I suppose. Well, it's got its own time zone. I guess you would call it Central Australia, but maybe or just South Australia will do. But I think we already touched on, I think, some of the risks or pitfalls. I think the first thing is to watch out for is for fads, because as you said, the speed and the range of content that's available now in terms of strategies, it's exploded. So I think, stick to the tried and tested, the proven performance of long-term investment in capital cities or big regional markets. I think the other thing is just not having a plan. I think it's quite common for people to make an investment, but then they sort of lose faith in the strategy because they never had a plan at the outset. So I guess an understanding of what's your borrowing capacity, what's your borrowing strategy, why you're actually investing in property in the first place, how are you going to progress from this one to the next investment. I think all of those things you need to think about at the outset and not after you've already purchased the property, because it's too late then.
Well, buying a property isn't a plan, is it? It should be the physical manifestation of your plan. Okay, to finish off then, if you could sum up 2024 in one sentence, what would you say about the property markets?
I think more resilient than expected. And I think, again, people have underestimated the sheer weight of the aggregate wealth in this country. I think that, of course, there's market cycles, but Australia is a very resilient economy and housing market, and it's shown that again in 2024.
I think that aggregate wealth is one of the things that's going to drive the property markets in 2025. In other words, some people are still going to have difficulty with affordability because, as we've said, interest rates aren't going to fall as soon as we'd like them to. But a lot of baby boomers, a lot of people who bought their houses 10, 20, 30 years ago have got significant equity in their homes, and they're going to upsize, downsize. They're going to help their kids through the bank of mum and dad. And as we spoke a few months ago, PEXA showed that I think it was over 30% of properties in Sydney and Melbourne were bought without a mortgage. So it's likely that the upper end of the market, which was a little bit slower, people held back a bit in 2024 at the top end, and the lower end did well. I can see that coming back next year.
It feels like it, doesn't it? And it's always worth remembering that these things are cyclical, and some of the stuff that might have underperformed over a year or two could be the best performer over the period ahead.
Definitely. Well, thanks for your thoughts. Thanks for your insights. And Pete, we'll be catching up once a month with our Big Picture podcast to talk about the macroeconomic factors that are driving our economy and our housing markets. But I'll leave a link to your two books in the show notes so people can find out where to get those. And also, I enjoy getting your daily musings and actually, I listen to your 2 Cents podcast when I go for my walk with your podcast with Chris Bates every Sunday. I look forward to that. So I'll leave in the show notes some ways people can keep in contact with you. Look forward to catching up again real soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Michael.
In a moment, I'm going to share my popular mindset message with you. But before I do, I'd like to just follow on my discussion with Pete, where I think you got the hint that we believe 2025 is going to be another good year for property. It's going to be another steady year, but the markets are going to remain fragmented. But if you're like many people listening to this podcast, if you're like many people who read my regular property update blog, you're probably feeling a bit uncertain about the market. You're not alone. Many property investors I speak to are in the same boat. They're bombarded with conflicting information, unsure about the next steps. In one way, there's information overload about all the news about the economy and inflation and interest rates in the housing markets. And at the other end, there's too many opinions, but maybe not as much clarity. And I think that's made some people fear, hold back, stop, and not move forward. I'm sure you've heard Warren Buffett say, be fearful. Well, you may not have heard him say, but you may have heard that he said, be fearful when others are greedy and be greedy when others are fearful. I know there's a lot of people we're currently seeing at Metropole who finished 2024 not doing anything and now regret it when some markets have had significant growth, double-digit growth. So what we'd like to do is help you gain clarity where others see chaos. Why not have a chat with one of the wealth strategists at Metropole and get a clear plan based on solid fundamentals? We always start with talk about a strategic property plan. People come and ask us, where should I buy? How much should I buy? Is this a good suburb? No, what we start with is understanding where you are, where you want to get to. And sure, we're buyer's agents, but we're much, much more than buyer's agents. We help our clients safely grow, protect, and pass on their wealth to future generations through strategic property and wealth advice. So let us help you define your goals, set them, make sure they're realistic, help you track your progress using some fantastic software that we use that you will have access to so you can keep track of it all. And we're going to help maximize your wealth creation, but at the same time, identify and mitigate risks. Go to metropole.com.au, find out how we can help you safely outperform the markets and take advantage of the property cycle of 2025.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to share with you the concept that pessimism prevents success. It actually perpetuates poverty. So let me ask you a question. Are you an optimist or a pessimist? And that's an important question because pessimism is a recipe for failure. Now, I guess most pessimists don't even realize they're pessimists. They just think what they're thinking is natural. But let me share with you the results of a paper that was a study done many years ago at the University of Cologne in Germany, where they studied more than 68,000 Americans and Europeans, and they found that pessimism causes poverty. In fact, I don't know a rich pessimist. But anyway, the study showed that pessimists make you wary of trust. Pessimism makes you wary of trusting people. That sort of follows, doesn't it? It went on to argue that when you see people in a pessimistic light, untrustworthy, self-interested or deceitful, you're less willing to rely on others. Those in the study who are the most pessimistic also, interestingly, happen to be the poorest. If you're wary about trusting others, you're likely to have a lower income now and in the future, the study concluded. Conversely, the study showed that those who were optimistic and had a more trusting view of others had higher income than pessimists. You see, pessimists miss out on opportunities because they're less likely to ask for help, less likely to collaborate with others. I have found that no one succeeds on their own. Look, I've spoken about this often. I've written about them. You need a team around you, whether it's in property investment or in all sorts of areas. On your own, you may be able to run faster, but together as a team, you run further. And of course, if you're the smartest person in your team, you're in trouble. You need a team of other people who believe in you and help you succeed. It's virtually impossible to succeed on your own, but that's nothing new. You look at the most successful self-made millionaires, Richard Branson, Elon Musk, all the big people, they've got a team around them. They also happen to be the most optimistic people to work for. Their unbridled optimism infected everyone around them, a bit like a virus. So if you're a pessimist, you're literally sabotaging your life. You're pushing the very people you need away, and you're left with no choice but to rely on your own. So the message for today for you is pessimism is a recipe for failure. Thank you for spending the last little while with me. I hope you got some benefit from this show. But before you move on to the next podcast you're going to listen to, let me remind you I have another show that I produce once a week with leading demographer Simon Kirstenmacher. We call that Demographics Decoded, where Simon and I unveil the trends that are going to shape your future. In my mind, this is a must-listen to podcast for anyone interested in property investment, but also for business people and entrepreneurs. So if you don't currently subscribe to Demographics Decoded, just please stop for a second and subscribe on your podcast app where you're listening to this, or on YouTube. And of course, if you don't subscribe to this show, the Michael Yardney Podcast, why not click the link that says follow or subscribe wherever you're listening right now. So twice a week, you're going to get benefit from my guests and me. Oh, and I'd like to ask you a little favour, please. If you did enjoy today's show and you know somebody who would also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney Podcast and Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcast, there are 3 little buttons at the top of the player. Or just tell them about it. Just have a chat with them. Now, I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing me a favour in my quest to help as many people as possible to become financially literate. And by the way, I've got a special bonus for you. As my way of saying thank you for subscribing, just go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where I've got a bunch of ebooks and reports. It's just my way of saying thank you for taking the time to listen. And remember, the information that we give you in this podcast is general information, not specific information about your personal circumstances, because we don't know about them. But if you do want specific information, you can always have a chat with my team at Metropole. Go to metropole.com.au. If you really want to learn more, you can always listen to the previous podcast, the many episodes we've already published. Just go back to the old episodes, which each have lessons about property investment, success, and money. Once again, thanks for listening to today's show.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney Podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael, but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?